Well, like I said, last week we started a series on God moments, and we're really looking at how God meets us in the place where we're at. And so many times it's surprising that the place that we're at, that God meets us, is in really the low spots of our lives, the times where life is falling apart. That's when God has a way of showing up. And I think there's really at least two reasons for this. I want to point out two reasons why God shows up when our lives are falling apart. The first is when our lives are falling apart, we're more open to actually being rescued. I mean, I want you to think about this. If you were, swimming in the lake and there's a lifeguard around, but you're swimming and you're fine, you're not looking for the lifeguard to save you. Why? Because you're fine, right? I'm good in here. But if you're drowning, you're looking for the lifeguard to jump in the water to come and rescue you and to save you. Why? Because you're open to their saving when you're in trouble. Well, I think the same is true with God. When we tend to ignore him when life is good, when we don't need, when we're not struggling, we don't need God to help and to save us. But when we're at that low spot, now we're open to God to come in and save us and to rescue us from the mess that we're in. The second reason, though, is we tend to be more open to meet God when our lives are falling apart, because it really is the story of the Bible. And it might surprise you, but listen, if you crack open your Bible, you start reading it, you're going to find page after page of real people whose lives are falling apart, whose relationships are a mess between them and others and their friends and their families. And really, you're just going to see messy lives. That's what you're going to see in the scriptures. And in truth, they look a lot like our lives, really. I mean, that's why actually the Bible can be very relatable, is you look and you're like, wow, that person, I get it. I've been there and my life is a mess. But listen, here's the thing about the Bible. It tells us why. It tells us why life is a mess and what God does to fix it. The why is simply sin. And we read this in Romans 3:23, the wages are for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So everyone has sinned. And here's the deal. I think it's easy actually to see that. When we look around at the world we live in today and what other people are doing, it's easy to see that people have done me wrong, right? I mean, that's easy. I've been hurt, I've been done stuff, and it's easy to diagnose the problems in this world to something called evil. That person was evil to me. The challenge comes, and we struggle with this, is owning our sin, right? That's where we have wronged others, where we have wronged God, and our actions are evil. We have a problem calling that evil, but sin is the why to what is going on in this world, why our relationship with God and with others is messed up. It's a why to why the world is the way it is. And so when I say that the story of the Bible is about God fixing our lives at the spot they're falling apart, it is literally what he did. I mean, this is why Jesus came and died on the cross, and it was to cover our sins and to give us a new life that we could now live, but we couldn't live it without his grace and mercy. And so this is the message of the gospel and the truth of what we need. That's the whole story of God, is he came and he loved us when we were not lovable. He came and he searched for us when we weren't searching for him. And in fact, we never could earn our love for God. So many people try, but you never can earn your love for God. Our predicament is this bad. Look what Romans 3:10-12 says. There is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. Listen, there's no one who seeks God. All have turned away, and all alike have become worthless. There's no one who does what is good, not even one. That's the predicament we're in without God. We're not even looking for him, or we're worthless. Our lives apart from God are that. And so the amazing love story of the Bible is this. God has not stopped loving his creation, even when his creation has stopped loving him. And so people have rejected God, but God comes in and still shows his love for us even at our worst. And so encountering that love is what we see changes our lives. That's what changes people. So my prayer today is that we meet God and we have this encounter with God and we experience his compelling love for us, because I know that changes us. So today we're going to walk through a really important story of a woman named Hagar. Her story is actually very much overshadowed by the story of Abraham and Sarah in the Bible, but it's a really important story, and we're going to see why as we walk through this together today. But it's important because it's a story about going through life and feeling insignificant, like no one cares, no one sees me. You know, we are used, we're emotionally beat up, we feel abandoned. If you've ever felt that way, this story really speaks to those things. I think all of us have had those times in our lives where we feel beat up, where we feel abandoned, where we feel alone. And it's just because this life wears us down and gets us to that spot where we think we don't matter. And when we think we're insignificant, guess what? It keeps us often from God. And it very much keeps us from walking in the life that God has created us to be. But quite frankly, we're believing a lie, because the truth is you're not insignificant. You matter to God. You're valuable to Him. That's what the Bible teaches us in Psalm 139, verses 13 through 14. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you. Why? Because I'm fearfully and I'm wonderfully made. We are that much valuable to God. You were created in His image, in His likeness. And He sent His Son to die for us. Because why? We're valuable to Him. He wants us to restore us back into a right relationship with Him. And when you realize that the Creator of the universe loves you, it changes everything. And so throughout this story, we're going to see this play out. There's two parts to Hagar's story that we're going to look at both of them. The first is found in Genesis 16. The second, we're going to jump ahead to Genesis 21, but they're both integrated. But again, that story of Hagar is wrapped up in the story of Abraham and Sarah. And I know most of you probably know that story, but I'm going to give you just a brief overview because it's really important. You know, Abraham and Sarah, God had set Abraham apart and said, hey, I want you to leave your country. He promised him that he was going to have a child and that he was going to make a nation from that child. The only problem is that they were too old to have kids. Do you realize they were too old even when God gave them the promise in the first place? But now 11 more years has gone by and still no baby. And Sarah's now 76. And there's no way that there's a baby coming when you're 76 years old. And so she goes to Abraham and she's like, Abraham, I have a plan. I have a plan to help God out. What do you think about this? So often that's what we do, right? When you're waiting for God's promise and it's not happening, you're like, all right, well, maybe God needs a little help. And so we start thinking of ways that we can help God bring about the promise He has given us, and it just never works. And so, listen, in the world that they lived in, it was very customary that if you're a wealthy family, you can't have kids, you have slaves, that you just take one of those slaves and your husband would have a baby with that slave. And they would try to have a child that way. Do you see the problem, though, right here? Listen, the world's way is never the way of God's way. They looked around and said, the world's doing it this way. Well, that seems to work for them. Let's do it that way. And it doesn't work out that way. Listen, it's actually, the world's way is very often completely contrary to God's way. And this was not the way God intended for marriage to be in the first place. And so when your plan doesn't come from God, it's going to come from the world. Why would you do that, though, when God is there to lead you? So let me show you two scripture verses that really compare the two ways we can go. The first is Proverbs 14:12, and it simply says this: there is a way that seems right to a person, but its end leads to the way of death. And then contrast that with what we're taught in Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways know Him, and He will make your path straight. And so the first way is what? It seems right. Let's do it. We don't know if it's right, but it just kind of feels good. So let's go that direction. And where's that going to lead you? It leads you so often into death. But the next way is I'm going to trust God fully, 100%, and I'm going to let Him lead me, and He's going to lead me in straight paths. So don't get your plans from the world. Trust God. Hagar is Sarah's Egyptian slave, and Sarah's plan is for Abraham to sleep with her servant. And Abraham agrees. Nothing bad looks like it's going to happen from that, does it? Like, whoa. Well, guess what? The plan succeeds, and it succeeds miserably. Like it succeeded all right. George MacDonald says this, and whatever man does without God, he must fail miserably or succeed miserably. Either way, if God's cut out of your plan, you're going to succeed, but it's going to be pretty miserable. So we read this in verses 4-6 of Genesis 16. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. And when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me, and your slave is in your hand," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." And then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So here you have Sarah's now mad at Abraham, and he's stunned. He's like, "What did I do? This was your idea. You told me to do this in the first place. It's not even my idea." But he should have known better, right? He really should have known. Look at the mess one little sin created. Now Hagar despises Sarai. Sarah begins to mistreat Hagar. Sarah blames Abraham for all the problems that are going on in here, and Abraham just wants to not be in the middle of any of it and just keep the peace. And he's just trying to look the other way. All from what? One little sin caused so much dysfunction into this family because why? They took matters into their own hands. And after being mistreated by Sarah, Hagar decides to run away. She's pregnant and takes off across the desert, leading back to Egypt. And we read this in verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. Hagar is not even looking for God, but God is looking for her, right? There he finds her. The angel of the Lord finds her about 50 miles away from where she left. And here's the thing. I think there's something significant that God waited to show up until 50 miles went by in Hagar's life. God knows when we're ready for his appearance. And he is patiently waiting for her to get to a spot where she's ready to hear what he has to say. Listen, we need to remember that so many times when we're praying for loved ones who need to have an encounter with God, and we're wondering, what's taking God so long? It's not God's the problem. God knows how long to wait to show up at the right time to speak to them so that they are open to finally meeting Jesus. And we read this in verse 8, and he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she says, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. And here's one of the subtle things that's important in the story that you could easily miss. Up to this point, in the story of Hagar, as we see it unfolding, Abraham and Sarah never refer to Hagar by name. They never refer to her by name. It's like they talked about the slave girl, the person. They never really saw her as a person. But listen, the moment God appears in her life, the very first words he speaks to her is her name. Why? He knows her by name. Isn't that amazing? Listen, one of the things that sometimes we feel in our pain and in our heartache when things aren't going right, no one understands, no one cares. We feel so insignificant. And what you need to realize is this: God knows your name. Why? He's the God who created the universe, but he is the God who knows you personally and intimately. And so there is God. He shows up and he knows her. God asks her a question though. He says, where are you coming from and where are you going? And in her response, she seems to know where she's running from, but not so much where she's headed. And that often happens in our lives. When we're hurt, we're running away, but we have no idea where we're running to. And running away, it never solves the problems. They are only solved when we face them head on. Now, that doesn't mean that there is not a time to leave. But here's what I'm going to let you know. When God wants you to leave, he always has a place in mind for you to go. He never wants you just running away from something. He always has something for you to go to. And there's the difference between where you know where you're at and letting God lead you is, am I just running away from something or am I running to something? The next thing God says to Hagar is very difficult, though. He says this in verse 9, then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. There's a word we hate, right? Submit. It means that we yield my will to the will of another person, and that's never easy when the other person is not treating us right. Hagar had a huge list of reasons that would justify not submitting and disobeying God. I mean, think about this. The legitimate fear of being mistreated again, she would be going back to that. How about the fact that she didn't even want to sleep with Abraham in the first place? Like, she did this because she was ordered to. It was easy. It would probably be easy for her even to explain away that maybe the angel of the Lord showed up in the desert because maybe she just was overheating, and she could explain away the vision as a whole. And there would be times in your life when God is telling you to do something that you don't want to do. One of the ways you know if you're really walking with God is if he tells you to do something you don't want to do. I always get leery when I'm around Christians who God always agrees with them. God always tells them to do the things they are already going to be doing. Because there's a good chance that God is not God, it's you're being God of yourself. So there are times when God tells you to do things that you don't want to do, and he even tells you to do things, at least in the short run, that are going to cause you pain and suffering. But if God says stay when you would rather go, it's much better for you to stay. Why? Because staying and obeying may seem tough, but it's way worse than disobedience. It's way worse than not obeying God. And when God tells her this, though, he adds giving her a promise that helps her obey what God is telling her to do. Take a look. It's found in the next couple verses. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord said to her, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery, and he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. And what do we learn about God's promises last week? First of all, God's promises come purely out of his grace. They're purely a display of his love. Hagar didn't earn God's promises, but God gives it to her because he loves her. He sees her. He cares about her. God's promise was that she would have a boy, and he would be more, and he would go on to have so many descendants that you would not even be able to count them. That was a promise God gave her. God told her the name she was to give to her son, and that his name would be Ishmael. Ishmael literally means God hears. So think about this. Every time she calls Ishmael, where would she remember? God named my boy, and God says he hears me. But there is even more, and there's this odd description in here, and it says he would be a wild donkey. And we interpret that in American terms. A donkey's not a good thing to call a person, right? and it's somebody not. But I want you to think about this in perspective of who Hagar is. Hagar is a slave. She has no freedom. And God is saying Ishmael is not going to be able to be oppressed by anyone. He's going to be free, and nobody's going to hold him down. And God is speaking a promise that would have so much meaning to her. And just like Jacob, God meets Hagar at her deepest points of needs, and he gives her promises to hold on to. And this encounter changes Hagar so much. She does something that very few people have ever done in the history, and she gives God a name. Read this in verse 13. She gave God this name, who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. In Hebrew, the name is El Roi. Not El Roi, but El Roi. It means God sees me. And she goes, I have now seen the one who sees me. And so think about this. It might have been the first time she knows personally in her whole entire life of being a slave that she is seen by somebody who sees her as she really is, that knows her. God truly loved her. And in a moment of time, she knew God's love was undeniable. and completely change her life and the direction she's headed. What a difference it makes when we know that God sees us, that we're not alone, and that he's right there with us. I want you to know that today, no matter what you're going through, no matter what you're facing in your life today, God sees you, and you're not alone. You are loved. And God's love always comes with a promise. It's one of new life and new purpose. We read this in Ephesians 2:8-10. For you are saved by grace through faith, and this is not of yourselves. It's a gift of God, not from works, so that no one can boast. For what? We are God's workmanship. We're created in Jesus for good works, purpose, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do. But remember what promise means. We talked about this last week as well. It does not mean we get to avoid the difficulties and the struggles. The promise is given, why? To give us hope. To give us a sense of not giving up. For Hagar, that meant she still had to go back home. That was not going to be easy. But she steps out in faith. Why? Because I have the promise of God, of what he said he's going to do for me. And she returns home to Abraham and to Sarah, and Ishmael is born. Now, if we jump ahead to chapter 21, we have 13 or 14 years have passed since this time in their lives, and Ishmael's born, but now finally Sarah gives birth to Isaac, and he has been born. And you would think that everything would be great, right? Everything would be great in the family because now Sarah has a baby, and everything's good, right? But soon enough, we see that there's still problems in the family. That sin thing keeps popping back up and causing havoc. That one little sin, there it is, popping up in the midst of that family, causing problems. One day, Abraham has a party to celebrate Isaac being weaned. And it was a big deal in that time because, listen, if you could get to a spot where you're eating real food and you're weaned, there's probably a good chance that you're going to make it. And so there's a celebration that they would often have when somebody was weaned and now are able to be on real food. And at this party, Ishmael, who's about 14 years old, he starts teasing his little brother. And we don't know really what that was about, but it may have just been typical siblings teasing siblings. My kids pick on each other all the time. But Sarah's not having it. And look what she says. She's very upset. She says this in verse 10, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son." And you can see what? All this while, she has this animosity still building, this anger towards Hagar and Ishmael that's never been dealt with, and she's never been happy about it. So much so, again, she doesn't even call her by name. That slave woman, that woman and her son, get her out of here. The other woman must go, and so must her child. And this breaks Abraham's heart. We read this in verse 11. This matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. And you can imagine that he loves Ishmael. He's raised him for 14 years. And he's had him in his life. He loves him. He doesn't reject him. He has a great deal of love. And so he's confused a little when God says to him this in verse 12-13. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to what Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." When we hear Sarah tell Abram to send Hagar away, it sounds so mean-spirited, and it probably was. But God tells Abram to listen to his wife and to trust him to take care of Hagar and Ishmael. And I think that's tough because we're asking this question, right? How could God tell Abram to abandon his own son? How could God say that? But God didn't tell Abraham that. I mean, think about this. He told Abraham his promise that he gave Hagar over Ishmael. He let Abraham hear that. Hey, I have a promise. I'm going to turn him into a nation. What he's asking Abraham to do is trust him with Ishmael's life. Surrender your role and let me take care of it. God promises Abraham, I've got this. He promised he would never abandon them, and he's working his plan through this. And Abraham's still distressed, but the one thing we see in Abraham is this. He's not willing to disobey God. He's willing to obey God. And obedience often requires us to give up what we personally desire to follow God. But let me take this a step further. Think about this. If Abraham refused to give up Ishmael when God asked him to, he would have also refused to give up Isaac when God asked him to give up Isaac. See, I don't think we connect the dots sometimes in our own walk with God, how God grows us in faith. See, the times we obey him now set up the times we obey God later. And if we disobey him now, we continue to walk in disobedience later. But the more we obey him, the more we have faith to take the next step of obedience of faith with God. And so the next day, Abraham gets up and he gets some food and water and he sends them off without delay. Once he has God's word, he gets up and does it. And that's critical in our lives of faith. Because once we get a word from the Lord, sometimes our biggest test isn't obeying right away. Listen, often our disobedience is a result of us just waiting a little bit longer to obey. And almost always, what does that lead to? Delay means you won't obey. It means you will disobey. And so Abraham doesn't do that. He immediately gets up and he obeys. And Hagar and Ishmael feel like they're all on their own and abandoned again. What did they do? Hagar went back to submit to Abraham and Sarah, and it seems like all of that is falling apart. And now what, God? Sometimes obedience and submission leads us to feeling like we're going to lose the promise that God has given us. But here's the deal. God is faithful. Okay, in those moments, that's when we need to cling even more to Jesus, that he will be faithful to his promises. And they wander around in the desert of Beersheba for a while, and their food and water runs out, and the situation looks hopeless. How many times do you know that when the situation looks hopeless to us, God is about to do something? God is about to move so often when he gets us to a spot where there is no way that this could be fixed without God. And Hagar takes Ishmael. She gets him out of the sun. She leaves him under a bush, and she goes off away where she doesn't have to watch him die. And she begins to cry. We read this in verse 17 through 18. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. And lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Remember what Ishmael's name means. God hears. God heard the boy's cries. And he came in to Hagar to remind her, I gave you the promise. Hold on to it. I told you I would hear. I would hear the boy, and I will make him into a great nation. And what does he do? He reminds her of God's promises. Why? Because God's promises are given not to avoid the difficulties of life, but to help us cling to what God has said and to trust him that he's going to get us through those tough times. And that is why we need reminders of his promises. But then watch this, verse 19. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And so she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Watch this. The well was there the whole time. She just couldn't see it. It was there. And oftentimes when we're hurting, we can't see what God has provided, but it's there. And when we experience the presence of God, suddenly he opens our eyes to see his provision that had been there the whole time. It was right there. And it was there to sustain her and to get her through. And finally, we read this in verse 21. God was with the boy as he grew up, and he lived in the desert and became an archer. Listen, God was with the boy. He did not abandon him like he promised Abraham. Ishmael grew into a great nation, just as God had promised. He was over that nation. God was with him. And the last we hear of him is really at the funeral of his father, which really means this. While Abraham couldn't keep him around, he must have still kept in contact and had some form of a relationship with Ishmael that we just don't know about, that he actually shows up to his funeral and even cares that his dad died. But listen, as we close today, I want to take us to the New Testament, because there's a whole lot going on here that meets the eye. The Apostle Paul tells us that the story of Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael and Isaac is there to teach us something important about what God has done for us. You can read it in Galatians chapter 4, but let me just summarize it for sake of time. Ishmael was born because Abraham and Sarah, we already talked about this, they didn't trust God's plan, and so they tried to make another way. And when you reject God's promise, the only alternative is to find another way to fix the mess, because the mess is there. The mess is obvious. It's always there. The only question is, how do we fix it? That's the question the world wrestles with. The mess is obvious. How do we fix it? It's the reality of life. God uses this passage in Galatians to teach us the difference between trying to fix life through the law or through the promise. To be under the law was to be a slave to the law. And the fact that Ishmael was born of a slave woman represented being under the law, which leads only for you to remain in bondage. The law never sets you free, mainly because we keep breaking the law. And so when you break the law, you're back under the bondage and the punishment of the law. That's why the law exists, to put you back in order. Isaac was a result of the gift of God that came from God. The reason why God waited till it was completely impossible for Abraham and Sarah to have a baby was because there was no way they could make the promise happen. They could only do one thing: receive it as a gift. And that is what salvation is. It's a gift that we receive. When we're saved, we're no longer slaves. The only way, though, to salvation is to receive the gift that was promised to us in Jesus. And he is the one who sets us free. John 8:36 says, "So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." And so you and I, we need to be saved. And while you may feel today, well, I'm insignificant, God doesn't care. The truth is God does care. And you're not alone, and you're not insignificant. And even though God sees you and gives you a promise, we must receive it. We must submit to him and obey what he says. We must stop trusting ourselves and trust only in what Jesus has done for us. And he is where our salvation lies. And more than anything, if you don't know that you're saved, you need to know that message above anything else. God sees you. He made a way back to him, and he's offered salvation to you, but you have to receive it. Now, those of you who are saved, I want to leave you with a couple truths to ponder this week, because God has a few things for us to remember. First of all, this: don't make plans from the ways of this world. Too many of us are doing this, but we are also experiencing the mess that those choices have made in our lives. We're just not often connecting the dots that we have this mess because of the choices I made. It's easy to blame everybody else. Remember a principle: we reap what we sow. And that's good and bad things. And so you can go do sin, but you're going to reap the consequences of that. And we never get away from that principle. And so don't make your plans the way this world does. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Let him lead you paths and make them straight. The second thing many of us need to be practicing is obeying without delay. Some of us, we're just simply walking in disobedience because we put off obedience. We know what God has told us to do, and we're like, yeah, I'll do it later. And as I told you before, delayed obedience often leads to disobedience. And one of the keys to obeying God is when he tells you what to do, as soon as you can, you do it. As soon as the moment arises that you can walk in obedience to him, you put it into practice. And if you do that, you're going to find the freedom and the victory God has for you. And the third thing for you to take home today as a believer is that God sees you and he loves you. Listen, if there's something that too many Christians still walk with, it's a sense of insignificance. It's a sense of feeling like God doesn't see me, that God doesn't really love me still. I mean, Many Christians still feel that way. And life still wears us down. And I can tell you, even as a pastor, there's times where I wake up and I just feel insignificant. I feel like, man, does God even care? Does it matter? But I also know the power of that lie. Because if I give my attention to that lie, and I begin to rehearse that, I begin to believe that God doesn't love me, and it keeps me from him. And then it keeps me from walking in his plans and purposes that he's called for me to do in my life. But God has said this. He said it. He's given us promises. I'm never going to leave you. I'm never going to forsake you. He's proven his love for us. And so we have to cling to that. And so that's my last thing, is cling to the promises of God. They're meant to give you hope, to get you through everything that's coming your way. Whatever you're going through, what God has promised, cling to those things, because, again, they're given because life is hard. And God knows that this promise is what you need to hold on to, because it's going to get you through those times you want to give up, because it's going to strengthen you to say, I'm trusting God no matter what. And he's going to follow through, and he's going to show up. And it may take the last moment where everything looks like it's going to fall apart and there's no hope. That's when God, he specializes in those moments.